The sound of engines filled the air, a deep mechanical roar echoing through the skies over Europe. For months, German pilots had mocked the Americans for their so-called long-range fighters. They called them toys, machines for men who didn't understand real air combat. The Luftwaffe's aces, hardened by years of fighting over France, Poland, and the Soviet Union, had grown used to swatting away Allied bombers as if they were lumbering metal ducks. They laughed at the idea that anything could threaten their dominance in the skies. To them, air superiority was not just a tactical advantage, it was their birthright. But arrogance has a way of turning into fear. In the early years of the American bombing campaign, the Luftwaffe ruled supreme. High above Germany, bomber formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators stretched for miles, massive, glittering herds of silver beasts crawling across the sky. Their mission was simple but deadly: cripple the German war machine by destroying its factories, oil refineries, and railways. Yet each mission came at a staggering cost. The bombers flew brave and tight formations, but they were slow, predictable, and painfully vulnerable once the fighter escorts had to turn back. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the British Spitfire were capable fighters, yes, but their fuel tanks were small, their range short. They could only protect the bombers for part of the journey. Once they reached the limits of their endurance, they had to turn for home, leaving the bomber crews alone in hostile skies. That was when the Luftwaffe struck. The German fighters would swoop in from the sun, diving in coordinated waves. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s tore through bomber formations with ruthless precision, their cannons shredding through aluminum and flesh alike. Entire squadrons of B-17s vanished in smoke and fire, spiraling toward the ground. The airmen who survived spoke of the attacks with trembling voices, how the sky seemed filled with black crosses, how every direction was death. The Allies were bleeding in the air. Every raid cost dozens, sometimes hundreds of men. Yet the bombers had to keep flying. The industrial heart of Germany had to be broken if the war was to be won. Commanders in England and Washington knew the truth. Courage alone would not win this war of attrition. They needed a miracle, an aircraft that could protect bombers all the way to Berlin and back again. A fighter fast enough to duel the Luftwaffe's best, yet light and efficient enough to fly farther than any had before. It seemed impossible, until the Mustang was born. The story of the Mustang didn't begin in an American workshop, but in the offices of the British Purchasing Commission. In 1940, before the United States had even entered the war, the British Royal Air Force approached the North American Aviation Company with an urgent request. Britain needed fighters badly. The Spitfire and Hurricane were all ready, stretched thin, defending the island from the onslaught of the Luftwaffe. They needed more aircraft, and fast. North American, led by visionary designer Edgar Schmood, offered to build them something new instead of copying an old design. The British agreed, and in an astonishing 117 days, the prototype of what would become the Mustang took flight. It was sleek, beautiful, and promising. But beauty wasn't enough. The early models, fitted with an Allison engine, performed well at low altitudes but lost power above 15,000 feet, the very height where bomber battles raged. The Mustang was quick and maneuverable, but its heart was weak where it mattered most. For a while, it seemed destined to be another almost great aircraft. Then came the spark that changed everything: the marriage of American design and British engineering genius. Engineers fitted the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that gave the Spitfire its legendary performance. The result was nothing short of revolutionary. The P-51B Mustang could now soar higher, fly faster, and travel farther than any fighter in history. Its sleek laminar flow wings sliced through the air with minimal drag. With external fuel tanks, it could fly over 1,500 miles, enough to escort bombers deep into the German heartland, and still have fuel to fight on the way back. It was the weapon the Allies had been praying for, though few yet realized it. When the first Mustangs arrived in Europe, the reaction from German pilots was dismissive. Another American toy, some said. Pretty, but useless. They had heard such boasts before, yet soon whispers began to spread through Luftwaffe mess halls. There were new planes escorting the bombers, and they didn't turn back. They stayed, they followed, they hunted. The skies that had once belonged to Germany were no longer safe. In early 1944, bomber crews of the U.S. 8th Air Force took off from England under the shadow of German flak and fighter wings. For the first time, P-51 Mustangs flew above them, their long wings gleaming in the sunlight, the iconic bubble canopies catching the dawn. The German controllers watched their radar screens with confusion. The American formations kept coming, further and further inland. And still, the escorts remained. They didn't peel away near the Rhine like the old Thunderbolts. They didn't turn for home over France. They followed their bombers straight to Berlin. The first encounters were devastating. The Luftwaffe launched its usual ambushes, expecting to face helpless bombers. Instead, the Mustangs were waiting. They dove from altitude with surgical precision, tearing into German formations before they even reached the bombers. Pilots like Major Don Gentile, James Howard, and George Preddy became legends overnight. The Germans had never seen anything like it. The hunters had become the hunted. Panic spread across Luftwaffe units. The old tactics no longer worked. German commanders scrambled to adapt, but their resources were stretched thin. Fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, and relentless bombing of airfields left them with fewer and fewer options. For every Mustang shot down, the Allies built 10 more. For every German ace killed, there were no replacements. The Luftwaffe's proud fighting spirit began to erode. One German pilot described the feeling as being hunted by ghosts. The Mustangs seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with deadly accuracy, and vanish back into the clouds. They began to follow retreating German fighters all the way home, circling their airfields like vultures waiting for their prey to land. It was psychological warfare as much as aerial combat. The message was clear. There was nowhere left to hide. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Europe had changed. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the continent, now found itself fighting for survival. Airfields were bombed daily. Training schools were strafed. Even ground crews were not safe. The Mustangs roamed freely, hunting anything with a black cross on its wings. The legend of the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen flying P-51s in the Mediterranean, added to the aircraft's growing mystique. The Germans no longer laughed when they saw the Mustang. They feared it. Each mission the P-51 flew brought the Allies closer to victory. With the bombers now fully protected, the industrial heart of Germany was systematically dismantled. Refineries burned, factories crumbled, rail networks shattered. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend its cities or supply its armies. In less than a year, the once invincible German Air Force had been broken, its wings clipped by the very machine it once mocked. The Mustang had not just shifted the balance of power, it had redefined it. Air superiority was no longer measured in speed or firepower alone, but in endurance, precision, and control. For the first time, the Allies truly owned the skies. The P-51 Mustang had achieved what many thought impossible. It turned the air war over Europe from a desperate defensive struggle into an unstoppable offensive campaign. But to truly understand what this transformation meant, you have to imagine the feeling of being there. Thousands of feet above the ground, surrounded by enemies, your oxygen mask frosting with every breath, and knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, safety was hours of fuel away. For the bomber crews, every mission before the Mustang was a gamble with death. Without long-range escort, the odds of survival were little better than flipping a coin. With the arrival of the Mustang, those odds began to shift, one mission at a time. American bomber crews started noticing something remarkable. The same planes that had once vanished over the North Sea were now making it home. The same crews who had written letters before takeoff expecting not to return now walked back into their barracks alive. They could see, high above and ahead, the silhouettes of the Mustangs dancing in the sunlight, sleek, confident, deadly. "The Pony Boys are up there," one airman said. "We'll make it home tonight." That confidence was new. It was born from the presence of the P-51. For the Luftwaffe, those days were something else entirely. German pilots who had once flown with swagger now watched their fuel gauges like lifelines. They began to ration their sorties, saving every drop for critical missions. They flew shorter, more desperate attacks, often with new recruits barely out of flight school. Many of those young men never made it back. The once mighty airfields of the Reich, places like Rechlin, Augsburg, and Paderborn, became hunting grounds. Mustangs would sweep in low at dawn, guns blazing, catching aircraft on takeoff or landing, mowing through runways lined with fighters that never stood a chance. It wasn't just combat. It was annihilation from above. One Luftwaffe veteran described it years later. "We used to fear the flak, but flak couldn't think. the Mustang could. It followed you. It knew you. It was as if the enemy had built a machine specifically to kill us. The psychological toll was immense. Even hardened aces who had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets admitted they had never felt such helplessness. The German air defense network was collapsing. Radar operators could barely keep up. Every time they scrambled fighters, Mustangs were already there, waiting. American pilots, meanwhile, developed new tactics that made full use of their aircraft's range and agility. The days of tight escort formations were over. Commanders began authorizing free hunt missions, allowing groups of Mustangs to break off from the bombers and roam ahead, seeking out and destroying German aircraft wherever they could find them. This was a revolution in air warfare. No longer were escorts tied to the slow-moving bombers. Now they were predators, unleashed. They struck at enemy airfields, rail convoys, and fuel depots. Every German aircraft destroyed on the ground meant one less to face in the air. The results were staggering. Luftwaffe losses skyrocketed. Veteran pilots like Adolf Galland and Günther Rahl, who had once dictated the tempo of battle, found themselves constantly reacting, never initiating. Even when they scored kills, it made little difference. The Americans had a bottomless well of replacement planes and pilots. The Germans did not. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's pilot training pipeline had been reduced to mere weeks. Students barely learned to fly before being thrown into combat against veterans in superior machines. The outcome was predictable. Germany's Air Force was bleeding to death. Back in Allied briefings, the numbers told a clear story. Mission success rates climbed, bomber losses fell. The number of enemy fighters destroyed rose exponentially. The P-51 wasn't just winning battles, it was dismantling the Luftwaffe as a fighting force. The German High Command tried everything to counter it. They experimented with new tactics, even introducing advanced jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me 262. But it was too late. The skies were already lost. For the German pilots who had once laughed at the Mustang, the change was humbling and terrifying. They began to speak of the Americans not as amateurs, but as relentless professionals. "They never stop coming," one pilot wrote in his diary. "They follow you to the ends of the earth." The once proud eagle of the Luftwaffe was being hunted by a new kind of bird, a fast, fearless stallion that seemed to gallop across the clouds. As the air war intensified, the Mustangs didn't just escort bombers. They became an instrument of total air dominance. Pilots learned to exploit the aircraft's strengths to the fullest. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine delivered smooth power even at high altitudes where German engines struggled. The laminar flow wings allowed the Mustang to maintain incredible speed with minimal fuel consumption. In combat, it could dive faster, turn tighter, and climb higher than most opponents. A Mustang pilot could pick his fight, dictate the pace, and leave whenever he chose. In air combat, control was everything, and the Mustang gave its pilots complete control. Pilots spoke of the plane with reverence. Some said it felt alive, as though it anticipated their movements. Others described it as the first fighter that felt like it wanted to keep you alive. "She flies herself," one ace remarked. "All I do is hold on." In a war full of clunky machines and rough rides, the P-51 was smooth, elegant, and deadly. It was the difference between a racehorse and a workhorse, and in the hands of skilled pilots, it became unstoppable. Every mission the Mustangs flew pushed deeper into enemy territory. They strafed trains carrying ammunition, trucks hauling fuel, and convoys retreating from the front lines. The message to Germany was unmistakable. There is no sanctuary. Even the skies above your homeland belong to us now. And soon, not even the night would save them. The strategic effect was immediate. With their airfields under constant attack and their aircraft destroyed before takeoff, German ground forces began to feel the squeeze. Supply lines broke down. Frontline troops were left without air cover. The Allies, now confident in their command of the skies, could launch ground offensives without fear of air retaliation. The P-51 had not just won battles in the air. It had paved the way for victory on the ground. As D-Day approached, the role of the Mustang became even more critical. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, Allied air forces undertook Operation Point Blank, a massive bombing campaign aimed at destroying the Luftwaffe's ability to interfere with the landings. The Mustangs played a key role, escorting bomber formations that pounded aircraft factories, airfields, and fuel depots into rubble. When the invasion began on June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. German fighters that tried to challenge the Allied armada over Normandy were swarmed by Mustangs. The beachheads were protected from the sky, and the invasion succeeded in large part because of that domination. From that point on, the Luftwaffe never recovered. Every day, the skies grew emptier of German aircraft and fuller of American and British ones. The Mustang's long range allowed it to follow retreating German forces wherever they went. Even in the final months of the war, when fuel shortages grounded most of the Luftwaffe, Mustangs still prowled the skies, seeking out any sign of resistance. They had become, as one pilot put it, the executioners of the air. For the German people, the sound of a Mustang's engine became a symbol of dread. It meant that the enemy was not far away, that the war had come home. For the Allies, it was the sound of hope. The roar of the Merlin engine above the clouds was the sound of progress, of victory taking shape one mission at a time. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The Reich's once proud guardians of the sky were now powerless to stop the tide. The Luftwaffe's defeat was not just a military loss, it was psychological. The very idea of German invincibility had been shattered. The Mustang had exposed the vulnerability of the Reich in the most humiliating way possible, by following its enemies home and waiting for them to land. There was no greater insult to a fighter pilot than to be hunted over his own base. It turned heroes into prey and pride into despair. And so, as the war entered its final year, the German pilots who had once laughed at the P-51 Mustang now looked to the skies with fear. They knew that somewhere up there, in the cold blue vastness above the clouds, the hunters were waiting. The transformation of the air war over Europe was not an overnight miracle, but rather a steady, unstoppable wave of change carried on the wings of the P-51 Mustang. Each sortie, each victory, each mission that returned with more bombers intact chipped away at the Luftwaffe's once towering confidence. It wasn't simply that the Mustang was faster or flew farther. It was that it allowed the Allies to rethink the very nature of aerial warfare. Before the P-51, the air war was reactive, built around protecting what you could and surviving what you couldn't. After the P-51, it became offensive, surgical, and ruthless. The Allies no longer just defended their bombers, they dictated the battle itself. Imagine a Luftwaffe pilot climbing into his Messerschmitt on a frigid morning in early 1944. The airfield is half frozen, the sky pale gray. He's already heard rumors that the Americans now have a fighter that can cross all of Germany and back again. He doesn't believe it. Not yet. But when his squadron lifts off to intercept a formation of bombers approaching Leipzig, something feels different. The enemy fighters don't break away. They keep coming, diving out of the sun, their silver fuselages flashing like blades. Within seconds, tracer fire tears through the formation. The German pilot dives, banks, climbs, but they're everywhere. The realization hits. They've followed the bombers all the way here. They're not supposed to be here. And yet, they are. That moment, when disbelief turned to horror, was repeated across dozens of airfields in Germany. The P-51 had upended every tactical expectation. The Luftwaffe had built its entire defense network around predictable Allied behavior. Escort fighters would always turn back somewhere over Western Germany. That was when the interceptors launched. Now, that window of safety was gone. There was no predictable moment, no safe altitude. The enemy's reach was total. Allied air commanders quickly learned to exploit that shock. They used the Mustang's endurance to create chaos across German airspace. A typical mission might begin before dawn. P-51 squadrons would take off from English bases, rendezvous with bomber formations over the Channel, and then sweep ahead to clear the route. As the bombers approached their targets, the Mustangs would engage German interceptors head-on. Once the bombs were dropped, the Mustangs didn't simply turn home. They looped around and attacked retreating fighters, airfields, or transport lines on their way back. Each flight became a cycle of destruction, covering hundreds of miles. For bomber crews, the presence of the P-51 meant more than just protection. It meant morale. Those who had endured the deadly raids of 1943 remembered what it was like when the sky turned black with smoke and falling aircraft. Back then, one B-17 pilot recalled, you'd look out your window and see your friends getting torn apart, and you knew it was just a matter of time before it was your turn. But by 1944, the story was changing. Now, when enemy fighters appeared, so did the Mustangs. Sleek, fast, confident, they cut through the Luftwaffe formations with stunning precision. When you saw a Mustang up there, another airman said, you felt like you had a guardian angel with 650 cals. Meanwhile, in Germany, the tone of Luftwaffe briefings grew grim. Reports poured in from across the Reich: massive losses, pilots missing, aircraft destroyed before takeoff. The fuel crisis was worsening, and many flights were canceled because there simply wasn't enough aviation fuel to train or patrol. Hitler demanded results, but results were impossible without planes or pilots. Commanders proposed desperate solutions: camouflaged hangars, decoy airfields, night operations. But the Mustangs adapted faster than they could hide. They came at dawn, at dusk, even in the haze of winter storms. They seemed tireless, mechanical in their precision. The Luftwaffe's veteran aces, men who had once dominated the skies, found themselves reduced to symbols of a fading era. Pilots like Erich Hartmann, Walter Novotny, and Heinz Baer fought valiantly, scoring occasional victories, but their triumphs were Pyrrhic. Every victory cost irreplaceable fuel and another pilot. The Americans simply replaced what they lost, wave after wave. The Germans couldn't. What had once been a proud fraternity of elite flyers had become a handful of survivors clinging to a dying cause. By the summer of 1944, the P-51 had become more than a fighter. It was a psychological weapon. The Germans had a name for it: Der lange Arm, the long arm, because it could reach them anywhere. For the first time since the start of the war, the German homeland itself felt vulnerable from above. Cities that once looked to the Luftwaffe for protection now looked to the skies in fear. The sound of the Merlin engine, a distinct throaty hum, became synonymous with dread. It echoed over burning refineries, shattered train yards, and airfields strewn with wreckage. For the Americans, flying the Mustang was intoxicating. Pilots who transitioned from older aircraft described the difference as night and day. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been a powerhouse, a flying tank, but the Mustang was a dancer. It responded instantly, elegantly. The cockpit visibility, the smooth roll rate, the feeling of control at high speed, it gave pilots confidence, and that confidence bred aggression. Mustang pilots began pushing the limits of their missions, often volunteering to sweep deeper into enemy territory just to find more targets. They didn't wait to be attacked. They went hunting. One of the defining moments came during the Berlin raids of early 1944. For the first time, bombers struck directly at the German capital under continuous escort. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had, and for hours, the skies over Germany were filled with smoke and flame. When the battle was over, the losses were catastrophic. For the Germans. The Allies had lost bombers, yes, but the Luftwaffe had lost something more valuable: its best men. Veteran fighter leaders were gone, replaced by recruits with a handful of flight hours. It was the beginning of the end. From that point forward, the Mustang dominated every major operation. During the bombing of oil refineries in Ploiești, during the push toward Normandy, during the final drive into the heart of Germany, the Mustang was there. It had become the spearhead of Allied air power, the ever-present shadow that denied the Luftwaffe any chance to recover. Even when Germany introduced the Me-262 jet, it couldn't change the outcome. The jets were fast, but they were fragile, few, and constantly under threat from Mustangs that attacked during takeoff and landing. The technological leap came too late to matter. The Mustang's presence also changed how the Germans viewed the Americans. Before, the Luftwaffe had seen them as undisciplined amateurs, good at building planes, perhaps, but lacking the instincts of European flyers. The Mustang shattered that illusion. American pilots in their 20s were flying circles around German veterans with years of experience. Their coordination, discipline, and sheer numbers overwhelmed the Luftwaffe's finesse. The myth of German superiority in the air was dying, replaced by a harsh truth: industrial power and tactical evolution had beaten tradition. It wasn't only German pilots who felt the change. Civilians began to notice too. Allied air raids no longer came with the short, terrifying window of danger followed by silence. Now the danger lingered all day. Mustangs strafed trains, trucks, and convoys across the countryside. Farmers working their fields would look up and see the glint of silver in the sky, followed by the rattle of gunfire. Every movement on the ground was a potential target. The psychological pressure was relentless. It wasn't just the factories that were being destroyed. It was the will to fight. For the men who flew the Mustang, the experience left an indelible mark. They spoke of the long hours, the bitter cold, the endless expanse of sky. They spoke of dogfights that flashed by in seconds, of seeing enemy planes explode so close that debris peppered their own wings. They spoke, too, of the strange silence after victory, the moment when the adrenaline faded and the loneliness of altitude set in. For every triumph, there was loss. Friends who didn't return, empty bunks in the morning briefings. The Mustang had made victory possible, but it had not made it painless. Still, among the pilots, pride ran deep. They knew they were part of something historic. When the war ended and the statistics were tallied, the results were staggering. The P-51 Mustang had destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in the European theater alone. It had flown more missions, escorted more bombers, and achieved more kills than any other Allied fighter. But its true victory couldn't be measured in numbers. Its true victory was in the silence it created, the silence of German skies where once the Luftwaffe had ruled. As 1945 dawned, the air over Europe was filled not with dogfights, but with contrails stretching unchallenged from horizon to horizon. The Mustangs patrolled above the ruins, ensuring no resistance could rise again. They had done what no one thought possible. They had made the air safe for the Allies. They had ended an era of German domination that had begun 6 years earlier in the skies over Poland and France. The hunter had become the hunted, and now even the hunters were running out of prey. By early 1945, the writing was on the wall, and everyone in the Luftwaffe knew it. The skies over the Reich were no longer theirs. They belonged to the enemy, an enemy who never seemed to tire, who arrived with the sunrise and didn't leave until dusk. Airfields that had once been bustling with activity were now graveyards of twisted metal. The few aircraft that managed to take off did so, under the constant threat of prowling Mustangs. The P-51's long range meant that even after an exhausting escort mission, pilots still had enough fuel and ammunition to loiter over enemy bases, waiting for the Germans to return home. It was a cruel reversal of fortune. Not long before, it had been the German pilots who had waited to ambush the bombers as they limped back to England. Now the roles were reversed, and there was no mercy. The Luftwaffe's high command tried to maintain order, but by 1945 the air war had become chaotic. Experienced pilots were nearly extinct. Many of those who remained were worn down, flying outdated aircraft or untested prototypes. The factories that had once produced Germany's legendary machines were now smoking ruins, their assembly lines pulverized by the very bombers the Luftwaffe had failed to stop. When Hitler demanded to know why the enemy could strike Berlin at will, the answer was simple. Because the Luftwaffe could no longer stop them. The shield of the Reich had been shattered, and the Mustang was the hammer that had done it. Meanwhile, in the skies above, Mustang pilots went about their missions with grim determination. They were no longer just fighting an enemy. They were finishing a war. Many of them had flown hundreds of sorties, each one blurring into the next. The once terrifying sight of enemy flak bursts now barely made them flinch. Their confidence came not from arrogance, but from experience. They had seen what the Mustang could do. They had seen how it turned fear into dominance. They knew that, for the first time in years, the Allies truly controlled the battlefield above the clouds. For the German pilots still flying, life had become a desperate game of survival. They flew not to win, but simply to live another day. Every takeoff was a gamble, every landing a miracle. Mustangs roamed the skies in pairs and squadrons, using their superior speed and agility to chase down anything with wings. If a German pilot dove for cover, the Mustangs followed. If he tried to climb, they met him head-on. The old Luftwaffe tactic of diving away to escape was useless now. The P-51 could dive faster than almost anything in the air. The Germans had run out of tricks, and the Mustangs had no weaknesses left to exploit. The psychological shift was absolute. The Luftwaffe had once been the pride of Germany, a symbol of technological and tactical superiority. Now it was a ghost. The few surviving aces fought with grim resignation, their once proud unit insignias painted over with camouflage in a futile attempt to hide from the ever-watchful eyes of the Allied pilots. Even the propaganda machine, once so boastful, grew quiet. There were no more stories of glorious victories in the skies, only whispers of defeat and despair. One of the most haunting realities of the final months of the air war was how the tables had turned completely. In 1940, German pilots had hunted British bombers returning to England after night raids, shooting them down as they crossed the Channel. By 1944 and 1945, it was the Mustang pilots who circled like predators over German airfields, waiting for their prey to return. As crippled FW-190s and BF-109s limped home, the Mustangs would pounce. Many German pilots were killed not in combat, but in those final desperate moments when they were almost home. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. The hunters had become the hunted, and there was nothing they could do about it. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Mustang pilots still respected their adversaries. They knew the Luftwaffe had been filled with extraordinary talent, men who had once dominated the skies. There was a mutual recognition among pilots, a sense of shared fate. Both sides were bound by the same sky, the same dangers, the same fleeting line between life and death. Mustang aces like George Preddy, Bud Anderson, and Chuck Yeager often spoke of the skill and bravery of the German pilots they fought. They didn't see them as cowards or fools, but as worthy opponents trapped in an unwinnable war. They fought hard, one Mustang pilot recalled, but the machine we had and the momentum we carried, it was unstoppable. That unstoppable momentum wasn't just due to the aircraft itself, but the system that supported it. The Allies had mastered the art of coordination, radar networks, ground controllers, fuel logistics, and repair systems that ensured the Mustangs could fly constantly. Every part of the Allied war machine worked together to keep the skies filled. The Germans, by contrast, were disjointed and desperate. Their communication lines were bombed, their fuel trains destroyed, their radar stations crippled. The Mustang didn't just defeat enemy planes, it destroyed the entire infrastructure that made flight possible. As the Allies advanced deeper into German territory, the Mustangs began to operate from captured airfields inside France and Belgium. Each new base pushed their reach further east, and each mile of progress made the Luftwaffe's situation more hopeless. The Mustang was now flying missions over the very heart of Germany, sometimes returning with bullet holes and scorch marks, but always returning. For the German civilians on the ground, the endless drone of aircraft overhead became a constant reminder that the war was lost. In cities like Munich, Frankfurt, and Dresden, the air raids became almost daily events. Even when the bombers weren't in the sky, the Mustangs were. They strafed trains, carrying reinforcements to the front, destroyed vehicles along the Autobahn, and turned retreating columns into twisted wrecks. The Mustang wasn't built for bombing cities, but its guns and range made it perfect for cutting the arteries that kept Germany alive. Each mission drained a little more life from the enemy's war effort. It was around this time that the Mustang began to earn another reputation, one not just of fear, but of freedom. To the people of occupied Europe, seeing a P-51 in the sky meant the Allies were coming. The sleek silver plane with the white stripes on its wings became a symbol of liberation. Children would run into the streets to watch them, waving as they roared overhead. Resistance fighters whispered stories of the angels who flew above them. The Mustang had become more than a weapon. It had become a message. The war was turning, and freedom was returning with the sound of the Merlin engine. Yet for the pilots, the reality was far less romantic. Every mission carried risk. Even with air superiority, flak batteries and ground fire were deadly. Many Mustangs were lost, not in dogfights, but to the black puffs of exploding shells that filled the air like deadly flowers. Pilots who bailed out over enemy territory faced brutal captivity, and those who survived crashes often carried scars for life. But still, they flew. The Mustang gave them the means to fight, and more importantly, to win. That was enough. As the months dragged on, German morale fell to new lows. Training programs had collapsed entirely, and many new pilots took to the air with barely a dozen hours of experience. They were slaughtered in droves. One Allied intelligence report estimated that by early 1945, the average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe pilot was less than 2 weeks. Those who managed to survive longer often refused to fly again, citing mechanical failures or illness. The will to fight had evaporated. The Mustang had done more than just destroy planes. It had destroyed the spirit of resistance. The contrast between the early war and the final year could not have been starker. In 1940, the Luftwaffe had been an unstoppable juggernaut, the terror of Europe. By 1945, it was a shell of its former self, its best men gone, its machines obsolete, its skies lost. The P-51 Mustang, once dismissed as a toy fighter, had become the executioner of the Reich's aerial ambitions. And with every mission it flew, it carried the war one step closer to its end. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the Luftwaffe was effectively finished. Its remaining jets and propeller planes were scattered across makeshift runways, many without fuel to fly. When Mustang patrols passed overhead, German ground crews often watched helplessly as their aircraft were destroyed before they ever left the ground. The war in the air was over. The Mustangs had made sure of that. All that remained was to finish the war on the ground, a task made infinitely easier by the empty skies above. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, suffocating process that played out over months, each week tighter than the last. Every time the Germans tried to muster a defense, the Mustangs were there to rip it apart. It was a war of exhaustion, and the Germans were running out of everything: planes, fuel, men, and hope. In the final year of the war, the P-51 wasn't just an aircraft. It was the relentless reminder that the Reich's days were numbered. For Allied pilots, flying over Germany in 1945 was a surreal experience. There were still dangers. Flak and ground fire could still take a plane down, but the skies themselves were eerily empty. The great dogfights of earlier years were gone. Instead, there were strafing runs, patrols, and the occasional desperate clash with the few German fighters that still dared to rise. It was like watching a giant die slowly. "We used to fight to survive," one Mustang pilot later recalled. "Now we fought because there was no one left to fight us." The Luftwaffe's attempts to introduce new aircraft came too late to matter. The revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter could outrun the Mustang easily in straight flight, but it was plagued with problems: limited fuel, unreliable engines, and a shortage of trained pilots. Even when it did take to the skies, the Mustang pilots learned to strike during takeoff or landing, when the jets were vulnerable. The Germans had created the first jet fighter, but they could no longer control the airspace necessary to use it effectively. The Me-262 was a marvel trapped in a nightmare, and the Mustang was its executioner. By now, the Allies had achieved what military strategists call total air supremacy. It wasn't just that they could bomb anything they wanted, it was that they could do it whenever they wanted, with near impunity. The Mustang's extended range made it the guardian angel of every mission, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory and ensuring that German fighters never again dictated the terms of battle. It was a new kind of warfare, one that combined relentless air power with industrial might. The Mustang symbolized that shift: sleek, efficient, modern, and unstoppable. But for the pilots inside those cockpits, war was still personal. The sky was a strange place for reflection. Thousands of feet above the chaos of Europe, men in their 20s faced the most intimate form of combat imaginable: one-on-one duels at hundreds of miles per hour. They saw their enemies' faces, their fear, their courage, their last moments. Some pilots admitted that the thrill of combat was addictive. Others said it was haunting. "You never forget the first time you shoot someone down," one Mustang pilot confessed. "There's this flash of light, and then nothing. You go home and wonder if he had a family. Then you fly again the next day." For the Germans, those same encounters were battles against inevitability. They knew the odds. Many wrote letters to their families before each mission, knowing they might not return. Some chose to crash their planes into bombers when out of ammunition, a desperate act of defiance that spoke more to hopelessness than strategy. The Luftwaffe's greatest strength in the early war years, its daring, aggressive spirit, had turned into a liability. Against the Mustangs, recklessness was suicide. Precision and patience had become the new law of the skies, and the Germans could no longer afford either. As the Allies advanced on all fronts, the Mustang became an ever-present part of the war machine. It escorted bombers during daylight raids and strafed trains and convoys at dusk. It supported paratrooper drops, interdicted retreating forces, and provided reconnaissance for ground troops. Its versatility made it invaluable. There was almost nothing the P-51 couldn't do. It had become, in the words of one American general, the long arm of the Allied will. German soldiers on the ground began to fear the distinctive whine of its engine. It was said that you could hear a Mustang before you saw it, a sound that sent entire convoys scattering for cover. Trucks were abandoned, trains halted, and men dove into ditches at the faintest rumble overhead. The Mustang had turned even the simple act of moving supplies into a deadly gamble. With each passing day, the German war effort bled a little more, strangled by the constant pressure from above. For civilians, the experience was a mix of dread and awe. Children in bombed-out towns learned to tell the difference between Allied planes by their sound alone. Many would later recall how they watched the silver Mustang streak across the sky, graceful, yet terrifying. They didn't know then that those same planes were helping bring an end to the nightmare that had consumed their country. In some parts of Europe, especially in France and the Netherlands, the Mustang became a symbol of hope. The sight of those long wings meant the Allies were near, and liberation might finally come. But for the men in the cockpits, liberation came with a price. The constant combat, the endless missions, and the weight of loss took their toll. The fatigue was crushing. Pilots flew through snow, through fog, through enemy fire, knowing that one mistake could end everything. The P-51 was a marvel of engineering, but it was still a machine, one that demanded focus, endurance, and skill. Many pilots returned from missions with hands frozen to the controls, too numb to move. Some didn't return at all. The war might have been turning in their favor, but the cost was measured in lives. The camaraderie among the Mustang squadrons was unlike anything else. They lived together, flew together, and mourned together. Every empty seat in the mess hall was a reminder of how thin the line between life and death really was. The men gave their planes names: Old Crow, Glamorous Glen, Detroit Miss, not just out of affection, but as a way to humanize the machines that carried them through hell and back. To them, the P-51 wasn't just metal and fuel. It was a friend, a partner, a lifeline. The aircraft itself was a masterpiece of balance. It had speed, range, and agility in perfect proportion. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine gave it power at high altitude, while the laminar flow wing design reduced drag to levels no other fighter could match. Armed with 650 caliber Browning machine guns, it could tear through enemy aircraft or ground targets with devastating accuracy. Yet it remained elegant to fly, smooth and responsive. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the Mustang could outmaneuver almost anything. It wasn't the fastest in a straight line, but it didn't need to be. It won its fights by choosing them and by never running out of fuel to finish them. This combination of power and endurance redefined what air combat meant. Before the Mustang, air battles were short, chaotic affairs fought within narrow ranges. After the Mustang, they became sprawling, strategic operations that spanned continents. The Germans had no answer for it. Their planes were excellent, but they were trapped within their own limited range. The Mustang could go anywhere, fight anywhere, and stay as long as needed. In a war where logistics often decided victory, that endurance was priceless. As 1945 drew closer to its end, the Allied bombing campaigns reached their peak. Cities across Germany were reduced to rubble. The Luftwaffe, unable to contest the skies, could only watch as the Allies dismantled their industrial lifeline piece by piece. The Mustang had made this possible, not because it dropped bombs, but because it made bombing possible at all. Without it, the bombers would have been slaughtered long before reaching their targets. With it, they could fly unopposed. The strategic bombing campaign that crippled Germany's war machine owed its success to the P-51's protection. In the final weeks of the war, Mustang pilots began encountering fewer and fewer enemies. Many sorties ended without a single sighting of an enemy aircraft. Instead, their mission shifted to ground targets, destroying what remained of German infrastructure and supply lines. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to isolated pockets, some still flying outdated models, others grounded entirely. The war in the air had become one-sided, and the Mustangs were the enforcers of that new reality. Yet even in those final days, the dangers never vanished completely. Some of the last dogfights of the war were among the most desperate. German pilots, knowing defeat was inevitable, fought with reckless courage. They attacked in small numbers, often outnumbered 10-1, hoping to take at least one enemy with them. For the Mustang pilots, there was a strange mix of respect and pity in those encounters. They understood what it meant to fight a losing battle, to face an enemy stronger, faster, and more numerous, and to keep fighting anyway. It was bravery, even in defeat. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the pilots of the P-51 Mustang stood as some of the most celebrated aviators in history. They had taken a weapon once dismissed as a joke and turned it into the most feared aircraft in the sky. They had escorted thousands of bombers to their targets and brought countless crews home alive. They had shattered the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility and rewritten the rules of aerial warfare. But above all, they had proven that mastery of the air could decide the fate of a continent. The end of the war in Europe didn't happen with a sudden explosion of triumph, but with a long exhale, a release of pressure built up over years of blood and sacrifice. For the men who flew the P-51 Mustang, victory was bittersweet. They had seen the skies transform from arenas of death into empty, silent expanses. They had survived, but they had watched too many friends vanish in fire and smoke. When the surrender finally came, there were no cheers in the cockpits, no celebration in the air. The Mustangs simply landed and shut down their engines for the last time as weapons of war. The sound of silence after the Merlin engine faded was both a relief and a ghostly reminder of all they had endured. In those quiet days after the fighting stopped, the full scale of what the Mustang had accomplished began to emerge. Analysts pored over mission data, loss rates, and sortie numbers. The results were staggering. The P-51 had destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in the European theater alone, more than any other Allied fighter. It had escorted over 16,000 bomber missions and cut bomber loss rates in half. Perhaps most impressively, it had achieved this dominance in just over 2 years of frontline service. What had started as a rushed British design request had become the ultimate symbol of Allied air power. The war in Europe had been won in large part because of a fighter that could go anywhere and fight anything. But numbers told only part of the story. What truly set the P-51 apart was the psychological shift it created. Before its arrival, the Luftwaffe had fought from a position of confidence. Its pilots had mastered the art of interception, striking with precision and retreating before the enemy could respond. The P-51 changed that balance forever. No longer could German pilots dictate the terms of engagement. Now they were forced to fight on the Allies' schedule, on the Allies' turf, and often at the Allies' mercy. The Mustang had stolen not just their airspace, but their confidence. And once that confidence was gone, the Luftwaffe was finished. Even in the aftermath of defeat, German pilots couldn't help but acknowledge their respect for the aircraft that had beaten them. Many of them, interviewed years later, spoke with admiration bordering on awe. They called the Mustang the perfect plane, not out of flattery, but because they had witnessed its perfection firsthand. When the Mustangs came, said Ace Günther Rahl, the air war was lost. Coming from one of Germany's most decorated fighter aces, that statement carried the weight of truth. Rahl had survived the Eastern Front, the invasion of France, and the defense of the Reich, but the arrival of the Mustang had marked the end of German dominance. It was a weapon so complete that it left no room for recovery. The Mustang's performance on paper was impressive, but its true genius was in its design balance. Its top speed of 437 miles per hour made it one of the fastest piston-engine fighters in the world. Its operational ceiling of over 40,000 feet allowed it to escort bombers at altitudes beyond the reach of many German interceptors. Its range, more than 1,600 miles with external tanks, gave it the endurance to follow enemy aircraft deep into their own territory and still return home. Armed with 650 caliber Browning machine guns, it could shred enemy planes in seconds. Yet despite all that power, it was light, elegant, and stable. It was a machine designed not just to win battles, but to change the very nature of the war. The combination of the American-built airframe and the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was the perfect marriage of two engineering philosophies. The Americans had given it range, structure, and mass production. The British had given it soul. Together, they had created something that transcended its parts. Pilots who flew the Mustang often spoke of it in emotional terms, as if the machine itself possessed a kind of will. "You didn't just fly it," said one pilot. "You and the plane became one thing. It didn't fight for you. It fought with you." That connection between man and machine was rare, even in aviation. It was part of what made the P-51 so legendary. And it wasn't just a legend in Europe. In the Pacific, Mustangs would later escort bombers across vast distances, even to Japan itself. They were among the few aircraft with the range to make such missions possible. After the war, the P-51 continued to serve in Korea, where it proved once again that piston-powered aircraft still had a place in the jet age. It became a symbol of enduring excellence, an aircraft so perfectly engineered that it refused to be forgotten. Yet for all its technical brilliance, the Mustang's legacy was built on the human stories behind it. The pilots who flew it weren't just soldiers, they were pioneers. They were young men who learned to master the most advanced aircraft of their time, often after only a few months of training. They faced death every day, and they did it with the quiet understanding that their mission wasn't just to destroy the enemy, it was to protect their own. For every bomber that made it home, there was a Mustang pilot who had risked everything to make it happen. That bond between bomber and escort became one of the great partnerships of the war. The bomber crews, trapped in their flying fortresses, depended entirely on their escorts for survival. They could do nothing against the swarming German fighters except hold formation and hope. The Mustangs were their lifeline, their shields in the sky. When they appeared overhead, a cheer would ripple through the bomber formations. "There they are," someone would shout, and morale would soar. Those 6 gleaming guns, and that familiar engine note, meant salvation. Without them, there was only fear. The Germans understood that connection too, and they despised it. The Luftwaffe had once exploited the moment when escorts turned back, attacking bombers with surgical ferocity. Now, that window had closed. No matter how deep the mission, the Mustangs were there. The Germans could no longer isolate the bombers. Every attack became a brawl with equally deadly escorts. The air war had turned into a losing equation. For every German pilot who scored a kill, 2 more were lost. Every victory made defeat more certain. By the time the Mustangs were escorting bombers over Berlin, the Luftwaffe's fate was already sealed. And yet, even as the Mustang became an icon of Allied victory, it also carried a heavy moral weight. Total air dominance meant total destruction. With the Luftwaffe gone, there was nothing to stop the relentless bombing of German cities. Industrial centers like Hamburg, Essen, and Cologne were reduced to rubble. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the firestorms that followed. The same aircraft that had saved Allied lives also enabled devastation on a scale never seen before. The P-51 was a tool, a beautiful, efficient tool. But what humanity did with it was something far more complicated. Still, in the eyes of history, the Mustang remains a symbol of triumph. It represents the moment when technology, strategy, and courage aligned perfectly. It's remembered not just for its victories, but for what those victories made possible. Without the P-51, the bombing campaign might have failed. Without that campaign, the war in Europe might have lasted years longer. The Mustang didn't just help win the war, it helped end it. When Allied forces advanced into Germany in 1945, they found airfields littered with the remains of what had once been the most powerful air force in the world. Burned-out Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts lay scattered across the tarmac, some half-finished, others destroyed by their own crews to keep them from falling into enemy hands. On those same airfields, P-51s now landed, their engines cooling beside the wreckage of the planes they had defeated. It was a visual metaphor for the end of an era. The German Eagle had fallen, and the Mustang now stood in its place. In the months after victory, the Mustang continued to fly. But its mission had changed. No longer a hunter, it became a guardian. It escorted supply flights, patrolled occupation zones, and carried messages between Allied commands. In peacetime, its sleek form seemed almost out of place, a predator without prey. Yet even then, it remained a reminder of what it had achieved. Pilots who flew it in those post-war days spoke of the strange feeling of calm that came with flying the same machine that had once lived in chaos. "It felt like the sky was finally ours," one pilot said. "For the first time, we weren't fighting for it." The transition from war to peace was strange for the men who had lived so long in the cockpit. The sudden stillness felt unnatural. For years, their days had been measured in sorties, missions, takeoffs, and landings. Their nights filled with the hum of engines that seemed to echo even in dreams. Now the world was quiet. The skies that had once been filled with contrails and fire were open again, blue and empty. For many pilots, it was a silence that took time to trust. Some found peace in it. Others missed the purpose that war had given them. And yet, almost every one of them remembered the P-51 with something close to affection. It had been their companion through both terror and triumph. In airbases scattered across liberated Europe, lines of Mustangs sat gleaming in the sunlight, their once-patched bullet holes now carefully repaired, their noses painted with the bright colors of victory. Mechanics who had worked tirelessly during the war now maintained them with a gentler touch, knowing these aircraft had become legends. Young recruits too late for combat approached them with awe, tracing the curves of their wings as if touching history itself. The Mustang had survived the war not just as a weapon, but as an icon of mastery, the perfect balance of form and function, of man and machine. Even as peace returned, the world was changing again. The jet age was dawning, and with it came the sense that the great piston-engine fighters of the war were already relics of a fading era. The Mustang had reached the pinnacle of propeller-driven flight, but it was also the last of its kind. Its sleek body and roaring engine belonged to a generation that had conquered the skies through human skill and raw mechanical power. Soon, speed and altitude would belong to jet engines and guided missiles, but for a few brief years, the P-51 represented the very height of human flight, where instinct and engineering met in perfect harmony. Many of the surviving Mustangs were shipped back to the United States, stored in hangars or sold as surplus. Some were bought by civilian pilots who used them for racing or display. Others were sent to Allied nations, where they continued to serve for decades. In countries like Sweden, Israel, and Australia, the Mustang flew again under new colors, still respected, still deadly. Its legend grew with every takeoff, every appearance at an air show, every story told by a veteran who had once flown it into combat. Even stripped of its wartime markings, it never lost its identity. Everyone who saw one knew what it was and what it had done. In the years that followed, the stories of the Mustang became almost mythical. Veterans told their children and grandchildren about the days when the sky belonged to the Pony Boys. They spoke of the roar of the Merlin engine at full throttle, the vibration of the guns firing, the feel of the controls in their hands. They remembered the fear, the exhilaration, the smell of oil and gunpowder. They remembered their friends, the ones who made it home and the ones who didn't. Each story added another layer to the legend, turning the Mustang from a machine into a symbol of endurance, courage, and hope. But to truly understand why the Mustang left such a mark, one must look back to the men it defeated. For the Luftwaffe, the arrival of the Mustang wasn't just a new enemy. It was a revelation of what they had become. Once masters of innovation, the Germans found themselves outdesigned, outproduced, and outflown. The war had pushed them to desperation, forcing them to experiment with jets, rockets, and even suicide missions. But none of it could overcome the simple, devastating efficiency of the Mustang. It wasn't exotic or experimental. It was practical, reliable, and perfect for its purpose. It didn't just outperform its enemies, it outlasted them. German pilots who survived the war often admitted their respect for the aircraft and for the men who flew it. "They came for us," one said. "They followed us everywhere. We used to think we could control the sky. Then the Mustang showed us we couldn't even control our own airfields." Another recalled the strange mix of admiration and fear he felt when he first saw a P-51 gliding silently out of the clouds, its polished wings catching the sunlight. "It was beautiful," he said quietly, "but it meant death." That combination, the elegance of its form and the ruthlessness of its purpose, defined the Mustang's legacy. The Mustang also redefined the way wars would be fought in the air. Its long range changed everything. Before it, air power was limited by geography. Fighters could only protect what they could reach. The P-51 broke that barrier. With drop tanks, it could fly from England to Berlin, escort bombers over their targets, and then hunt enemy aircraft all the way back. That range didn't just protect bombers, it extended Allied influence across an entire continent. In the post-war world, that concept of reach became the foundation for modern air strategy. Every long-range fighter, every refueling tanker, every intercontinental aircraft built afterward owed something to the lesson of the P-51. Even after the guns fell silent, its presence continued to shape the future. Engineers studied its design, learning from its aerodynamic efficiency and its adaptability. Pilots who had flown Mustangs went on to test new aircraft, the jets that would define the Cold War. Many of them carried the lessons they had learned from the Mustang into that new era. The importance of endurance, maneuverability, and trust between man and machine. The Mustang had been more than a tool of war. It had been a teacher. Yet beyond its influence on technology, the Mustang represented something deeper in the human story of the war. It embodied resilience. It proved that innovation could turn the tide, that courage could find form in metal, and that hope could fly on wings. To the Allied nations, it was a symbol of industrial strength and cooperation, a British engine, an American body, and pilots from all corners of the free world flying together toward a common victory. It was the physical manifestation of unity against tyranny, and that symbolism endured long after the last mission ended. As the years passed, the war receded into history, but the Mustang refused to fade. Air museums around the world began restoring them, polishing their fuselages to mirror brightness, painting them once again with the colors of the squadrons they had served. At air shows, crowds gathered as the familiar rumble of the Merlin engine filled the air. When a Mustang took off, people stopped whatever they were doing to watch. For a moment, the clock turned back, and the world was once again in that high, cold sky over Europe, where young men fought for survival and freedom. The veterans who came to see those shows often stood silently, hats in hand, watching the planes they had once flown. Some smiled, some wept. For them, it was more than nostalgia. It was memory made visible. Each flight was a tribute to those who never came home. Each engine roar was a heartbeat from the past. The Mustang, in its second life, became not just a machine of war, but a messenger of remembrance. There was also a strange kind of justice in how history remembered it. The Luftwaffe had started the war with the most advanced air force on Earth. By its end, it was undone by a fighter that didn't exist when the conflict began. The P-51's rise mirrored the story of the Allies themselves, late to the fight, underestimated at first, but relentless once it arrived. It represented the transformation of a scattered coalition into an unstoppable force. And just as the Mustang evolved from a rough prototype into a masterpiece, so too did the Allied war effort evolve from chaos into precision, from survival into victory. The Mustang story, then, isn't just about engines and wings. It's about the people who built it, the people who flew it, and the people who faced it. It's about what happens when innovation meets necessity, when courage meets opportunity. It's about laughter that turned to fear, and fear that turned to respect. Above all, it's about what happens when one idea, a simple one, the idea of range, changes everything. For years after the war, the P-51 Mustang remained a benchmark against which all other fighters were measured. Its legend only grew as stories of its triumphs circulated among veterans and historians alike. Every ace who had flown it seemed to have a story that bordered on the unbelievable, a desperate dogfight against impossible odds, a miraculous return home with bullet holes stitched through the fuselage, or a moment of sheer grace when everything aligned and the sky itself seemed to move in their favor. These stories became the backbone of the Mustang's myth, blending truth and reverence until the aircraft was no longer just remembered, it was worshipped. Pilots who had flown the Mustang often said it was the first plane that made them feel immortal. Not invincible, but as though for those few hours in the air, the line between man and machine disappeared. They didn't command it so much as merge with it. The control stick felt like an extension of their arm, the rudder pedals like an instinct rather than an action. It gave them freedom unlike anything they had known. Freedom from fear, from the earth, from limits. "You didn't fly the Mustang," one veteran said. "You wore it." That bond was part of what made the P-51 such a devastating weapon. It wasn't just an aircraft, it was an amplifier of human will. The Germans, who had once dismissed it, came to respect it in the only way soldiers ever can, through bitter experience. By late 1944, even the most loyal Luftwaffe pilots couldn't deny the truth. The Mustang had ended their supremacy. No matter how skilled they were, no matter how brave, they couldn't fight what they couldn't escape. German command tried to adapt. They shifted tactics, flying in smaller groups, attacking from below, using cloud cover, even launching intercepts at twilight when visibility worked in their favor. None of it mattered. The Mustangs adjusted faster. Their endurance allowed them to wait out their opponents, to circle overhead like patient predators until the Germans were forced to engage or retreat, and retreat often meant death. The Luftwaffe's younger recruits, barely trained boys pressed into service as replacements, stood no chance. They were thrown into battle with just a few dozen hours of flight time, facing Allied veterans who had hundreds. The results were predictable and tragic. Mustang pilots spoke later about the almost unbearable sight of shooting down aircraft that were piloted so clumsily, it was clear the man inside was barely trained. But in war, pity had no place in the cockpit. Survival came first, and mercy didn't win battles. So they fired, and they survived, and each kill was both victory and sorrow. Meanwhile, the Allied pilots continued to refine their tactics. The Mustang squadrons were often organized into flights that mixed experience levels deliberately. Aces paired with rookies, veterans teaching newcomers on the fly. The aircraft's forgiving handling made it ideal for that. It allowed young pilots to learn quickly without being overwhelmed, and it gave seasoned ones the flexibility to push the limits. That mix of mentorship and innovation created a self-sustaining machine of improvement. The longer the war went on, the better the Mustang pilots became, even as the Luftwaffe's quality collapsed. It was this widening gap, of skill, of technology, of resources that truly define the endgame of the air war. The Mustang didn't win through sheer speed or power. It won through endurance and adaptability. It forced the Luftwaffe to fight battles it couldn't afford and then denied it the time to recover. It was a war of attrition fought at 30,000 feet, and the Mustang was the perfect weapon for it. It didn't just destroy planes, it destroyed systems. Every time it strafed a fuel convoy or bombed a runway, it cut another artery of German resistance. Every flight that returned safely allowed the next one to go farther. Every victory built momentum. The war wasn't won overnight. It was strangled slowly, efficiently, by wings of polished aluminum and the roar of Merlin engines. Back on the ground, Allied commanders began to notice the difference. By early 1945, bombing missions that had once been nightmares were now routine. The bombers flew in formation, their gunners relaxed, their missions predictable. They could cross into Germany, strike their targets, and return with minimal losses. It was a transformation few had dared to imagine a year earlier. The bomber crews knew who to thank. "If it weren't for those Mustangs," one B-17 pilot said, "we'd be ghosts." The escorts had turned what was once suicide into strategy. But while the Allies grew stronger, the Germans grew desperate. The Luftwaffe began to deploy teenage pilots, men from training schools barely out of adolescence. They were told they were fighting for the fatherland, that they were the last hope. Many didn't last a single mission. They would take off, climb into the sky, and be cut down before they ever saw the bombers. To the Mustang pilots, these engagements became less about glory and more about endurance. It wasn't a duel anymore. It was a grim duty. The Mustang's greatest strength, its ability to project power without pause, had made the air war relentless. Even victory could feel hollow. The German High Command tried one last gamble, the introduction of the jet. The Messerschmitt. Me-262 was a marvel of engineering, capable of speeds no propeller-driven plane could match. For a brief moment, it looked as though the balance might shift again. But even this miracle weapon couldn't turn the tide. There weren't enough of them, and they were constantly grounded by fuel shortages and Allied bombing. The Mustangs adapted once more, learning to strike the jets as they took off or landed, when their engines were most vulnerable. The jet may have been the future, but the Mustang owned the present. It was the final insult, the most advanced aircraft in the world, defeated by a piston-engine fighter that shouldn't have been able to catch it. By the time the war ended, the Luftwaffe was effectively extinct. Its planes lay in ruins across airfields from Berlin to Bavaria. Its pilots were dead, captured, or grounded. The once proud eagle of Germany had been plucked feather by feather until nothing remained. The Mustang hadn't just beaten it, it had erased it. For the Allies, that victory meant more than air superiority. It meant freedom to plan the end of the war on their own terms. Ground forces could move without fear of attack. Supply lines could operate in daylight. The enemy could no longer see or strike from above. The skies belonged to the Allies, and the Mustang had claimed them. As Europe celebrated liberation, the pilots who had flown those final missions returned to their bases exhausted but alive. They had seen the worst of war from a vantage point few others ever would. They had watched cities burn from miles above, seen the flash of explosions far below, and felt the strange detachment that came from killing at a distance. They had been called heroes, but most didn't feel like it. They were men who had done what needed to be done. And when the war ended, they stepped down from their cockpits and tried to return to a world that had no idea what it felt like to live in the thin air between life and death. The Mustang itself also began its own transformation. The same plane that had once carried war now carried peace. Some were converted into reconnaissance aircraft, others used for flight training or racing. Its elegant design, once optimized for combat, now became a symbol of speed and beauty. Aviation enthusiasts around the world sought to preserve it, to keep it flying not as a weapon, but as a piece of living history. And as the years passed, the sound of the Mustang's engine became something new, a sound of remembrance rather than fear. But even decades later, the legacy of the Mustang was still tied to those war years when it ruled the skies. Historians continue to debate its exact role in the downfall of the Luftwaffe, but few disputed its importance. It was the aircraft that allowed the Allies to do what no one else could: sustain offensive air power deep inside enemy territory, continuously and effectively. It turned the air war from defense into domination. It wasn't just a tactical victory, it was strategic annihilation. And in doing so, it redefined what modern air warfare would mean for generations to come. The Luftwaffe pilots who survived carried their own memories of those days. Many admitted in quieter moments that they had once laughed at the American fighters, dismissing them as crude imitations of European craftsmanship. They had been wrong. The P-51 was proof that simplicity and endurance could defeat sophistication and arrogance. It was a hard lesson learned in fire. "We laughed at them once," said one German veteran, "but by the end, we prayed we would not see them." Few phrases capture the Mustang's impact more completely than that. The laughter that had once echoed in Luftwaffe hangars, the smug confidence of Germany's best pilots, had long since turned to silence. Those who had survived spoke of the Mustang in hushed tones, as if it were not merely a machine but a force of nature. Inevitable, unstoppable, indifferent. It wasn't that the Mustang was invincible. It could be shot down like any aircraft. But its sheer presence, its endurance, and the relentless pressure it exerted on the Luftwaffe made it something more than just a fighter plane. It was a shadow that hung over every German mission, a reminder that no matter where they went, they were being watched. For the Germans, the psychological effect was devastating. Every pilot who took off knew that somewhere above him, a P-51 might be waiting. That constant fear gnawed at morale, eroding confidence in ways no bomb or bullet could. The Luftwaffe had once been built on the idea of superiority, technical, tactical, and moral. Its pilots believed themselves to be the best in the world. That belief had carried them through the early triumphs of Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. But when the Mustang arrived, it destroyed that myth. It didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe in the air, it shattered its spirit. The German High Command tried to reframe the defeat as a matter of resources, not skill. They blamed shortages, fuel, and numbers. And in part, they were right. The Allies had the advantage of industrial power on a scale Germany couldn't hope to match. But even that explanation failed to capture the full picture. The Mustang wasn't merely a product of industrial strength. It was the product of ingenuity, adaptation, and timing. It was proof that the Allies had learned from their early failures that they could innovate as quickly as the enemy. It showed that the war would not be won by the side that started strongest, but by the side that evolved the fastest. To understand the Mustang's impact, it's worth remembering what came before it. In 1943, before its arrival, bomber losses were catastrophic. Some missions saw more than a quarter of aircraft fail to return. Entire squadrons disappeared into the clouds, never to be seen again. Each mission was a coin toss, with death. The introduction of the P-51 changed that overnight. Loss rates plummeted, and bombing missions became not only survivable, but routine. The Allied air campaign, once teetering on the brink of failure, now had the protection it needed to succeed. The Mustang didn't just save lives, it saved the entire strategy. That shift in strategy was crucial. Before, the Allies had been forced to fight defensively in the air. Now they could go on the offensive. They could bomb not just targets of opportunity, but the very heart of the German war machine. Its factories, its oil refineries, its transportation hubs. The Mustang's long range meant that even targets deep within Germany were no longer safe. And as those targets fell, the Luftwaffe's ability to fight declined further. It was a self-reinforcing cycle. The more the Mustangs escorted bombers, the fewer German planes could rise to meet them. And the fewer that rose, the safer the bombers became. The Luftwaffe was trapped in a spiral of destruction from which it could not escape. The German pilots who did make it into the air faced a new kind of battle, one they couldn't win through skill alone. The Mustang pilots were often younger, less experienced, but they were flying a plane that forgave mistakes and rewarded aggression. The Merlin engine gave them power at every altitude, and the aircraft's laminar flow wings let them sustain high speeds without losing control. German pilots found themselves constantly reacting, never dictating. Their formations broke apart under attack, their communications failed, and their confidence eroded. They could no longer choose when or where to fight. The sky had become the enemy's territory. Even so, some of Germany's best aces continued to fight on, determined to make their stand. Men like Adolf Galland, Walter Krupinski, and Erich Hartmann still scored victories in the war's final months. But each success came at an unbearable cost. For every Mustang they shot down, dozens of German aircraft were destroyed. The imbalance grew so great that some pilots began to question the point of continuing at all. Hartmann himself, the highest-scoring ace of all time, later admitted that by 1944 the war was lost in the air. "We were lions in a cage," he said. "We fought bravely, but the cage was shrinking every day." The Mustang was that cage. While the Germans struggled, the Americans thrived. The P-51 gave the Allied air forces an unmatched flexibility. Squadrons could operate far from their bases, strike multiple targets in a single sortie, and adapt to changing mission objectives mid-flight. If bombers came under attack, the Mustangs could close ranks in minutes. If enemy fighters fled, they could pursue them for hundreds of miles. The Luftwaffe's short-range interceptors simply couldn't compete. The P-51 had redefined what it meant to control the sky, not by numbers alone, but by reach. This transformation also changed the experience of those who fought below. Ground troops advancing across Europe began to notice something extraordinary. The enemy had lost its eyes. The German army, which had once relied on the Luftwaffe for reconnaissance and air cover, now fought blind. The Allies, by contrast, had near-constant air support. Mustang pilots would dive from the clouds to strafe enemy positions, destroy convoys, or scatter retreating units. It was as if the sky itself had chosen a side. German soldiers began to say bitterly, "If you see a plane, it's theirs." And most of the time, it was. The Luftwaffe's final months were a study in futility. Pilots flew outdated aircraft patched together from spare parts, often without proper maintenance or fuel. Training programs were reduced to a few hours in the cockpit before being sent into combat. New recruits were terrified, veterans were exhausted, and always, the Mustangs waited. The Germans knew they couldn't match the numbers, the skill, or the endurance of their opponents, but pride drove them to fight anyway. "We knew we would die," said one pilot after the war, "but dying in the air was better than waiting for the end on the ground." It was a grim form of courage, the kind that only surfaces when hope is gone. Meanwhile, in the Allied command centers, planners were already thinking beyond the immediate war. The success of the P-51 had revealed something profound about the nature of modern warfare. Control of the air meant control of the battlefield. The lessons of the Mustang were written into post-war doctrine. Range, endurance, and speed were no longer luxuries. They were necessities. Every future aircraft would need to embody those traits. The age of limited engagement was over. The age of global reach had begun. For the pilots who had flown through the worst of it, the end came not with victory parades, but with quiet exhaustion. They had given everything they had, and when peace arrived, they found themselves strangely adrift. Many left the service, returning to lives that felt impossibly still after years of motion. Some became test pilots, others instructors, and a few continued to fly Mustangs in air shows or peacetime patrols. But wherever they went, the memory of the plane followed them. They carried it like a ghost, a reminder of what they had done and what they had survived. The Mustang wasn't just a machine they had flown. It was a chapter of their lives written in fire and sky. For the world, the P-51 became a symbol of what victory looked like in the air. It wasn't bombastic or loud. It was precise, patient, relentless. It represented the idea that technology and teamwork, when perfectly balanced, could overcome even the fiercest opponent. It became a legend not because of propaganda but because of what it achieved. The Mustang turned the tide of the war by doing something simple. It stayed in the fight longer than anyone else could. Today, historians still argue about what made it so special. Some say it was the engine, others the aerodynamics, others still the tactics it enabled. But the truth is that the Mustang was more than the sum of its parts. It succeeded because it arrived at the exact moment it was needed, with exactly the capabilities the Allies lacked. It filled a void that had cost thousands of lives, and it did so with elegance and efficiency. In a war defined by chaos, it brought order. In a world drowning in destruction, it brought precision. And for the men who faced it, that precision was terrifying. German pilots had once scoffed at the idea that an American aircraft could ever rival theirs. But when the Mustangs began to appear over Berlin, they realized too late that the laughter had cost them everything. They had underestimated their enemy, and in war, there is no greater sin. By 1945, the skies of Europe told a story more honest than any speech or newspaper headline ever could. The contrails that once crisscrossed the heavens in frantic battle formations were now mostly one-sided. The Luftwaffe's lines had vanished. Its formations were gone. What remained was a calm, eerie kind of dominance, the serenity that follows a storm. And at the heart of that calm flew the P-51 Mustang, the plane that had rewritten the laws of aerial warfare. For the Allied pilots who had endured the early years of the conflict, the transformation was almost surreal. They remembered what it had been like before, those helpless missions where the bombers flew into Germany without cover, praying that luck and formation discipline would protect them. They remembered watching entire groups of flying fortresses disappear into fireballs. They remembered the gut-churning moment when their escorts turned for home, leaving them exposed. That memory never really left them. It was the fear that defined the first half of the war. But now, as they looked out their windows and saw Mustangs still flying beside them even over Berlin, they realized that fear was gone. For the first time, the sky felt like home turf. The Mustang's presence turned every mission into a declaration of dominance. Even when no German fighters appeared, the knowledge that they could appear and would be met instantly by the P-51 gave the Allies a psychological edge. The Luftwaffe had to live with the opposite feeling, constant vulnerability. Every sortie, every takeoff, carried the risk that a Mustang squadron was already in the area, waiting. The Germans began to call them the long-range ghosts, because they seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Pilots would later admit that simply knowing the Mustangs were out there changed the way they flew. They climbed higher, turned back sooner, avoided combat when they could. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter, had become the prey. On the ground, the effects were equally devastating. The Mustang's ability to operate deep inside German territory meant that nowhere was safe. Rail yards, convoys, even small supply depots far from the front lines became targets. The Germans could no longer move troops in daylight without risking annihilation from above. The country's infrastructure began to collapse, not only from bombing raids but from the relentless low-level strafing runs of the Mustangs. The fighter that had been built to escort bombers had evolved into something even more dangerous, a roving sword that cut every artery feeding the German war effort. Yet despite its fearsome reputation, the P-51 was not without vulnerability. Pilots knew that one mistake, a stall during a turn, a hit to the radiator, or a flak burst near the fuel tanks, could end it all. The Mustang's liquid-cooled Merlin engine was powerful, but it couldn't take much damage. A single bullet through the coolant line could mean disaster. Many Mustangs never made it home because of that weakness. Still, those who flew them understood that their survival depended on more than luck. It depended on speed, precision, and instinct. The Mustang rewarded the pilot who respected it. It punished the one who didn't. The relationship between man and machine was intimate. Pilots would describe the way they could feel the aircraft's mood, the way it vibrated under stress, the way the controls stiffened as the speed climbed. They learned to sense danger through the Mustang's reactions, almost as though it were alive. In combat, that sensitivity was everything. It meant the difference between rolling away from a burst of gunfire and becoming another streak of smoke against the clouds. The P-51 wasn't forgiving, but it was honest. It did exactly what you asked of it, no more and no less. That honesty forged trust, and that trust forged legends. By the time Allied forces crossed into Germany, the Mustang had become more than a plane. It was an omen. German ground troops learned to fear the distinct whine of the Merlin engine. To them, it meant that the Allies were close, that the front was collapsing. That retreat might be their only option. There were even stories of German convoys halting at the mere sight of contrails, scattering before a single shot was fired. The power of the Mustang wasn't just in its guns or speed, it was in what it represented: inevitability. And inevitability was exactly what the Luftwaffe faced. Every month brought fewer sorties, fewer experienced pilots, fewer functioning aircraft. What had begun as the most formidable air force in the world was now running on fumes. By contrast, the Americans seemed to have endless reserves of both men and machines. Even if a Mustang was lost, another took its place within days. For the Germans, this imbalance was demoralizing beyond measure. It was like fighting the ocean, one Luftwaffe veteran said. You could shoot down a wave, but the tide never stopped coming. The Mustangs didn't just attack airfields, they haunted them. Allied intelligence made it clear that one of the best ways to cripple the Luftwaffe was to destroy its aircraft before they ever left the ground. So Mustang squadrons began targeting bases directly. They'd arrive just after dawn when visibility was perfect and dive in from the sun. The attack was over in minutes, rows of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts reduced to burning wreckage. Even the ground crews weren't safe. The Luftwaffe's ability to recover shrank with every raid until eventually their once mighty network of bases became nothing more than graveyards of twisted metal. In those final months, German pilots flew because they had to, not because they believed they could win. Each mission was an act of fatalism. They knew the outcome before they left the ground. Some tried to save fuel, others tried to fight to the end, but all of them knew what was waiting for them in the sky. The Mustangs were there, patient and merciless. What had started as a technological advantage had become psychological warfare of the purest kind. When the enemy knows they are doomed before the battle even begins, you have already won. Even the German civilians began to notice the shift. During the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe had been a symbol of protection. Its pilots were heroes, its aircraft a source of national pride. Now, those same citizens watched helplessly as Allied fighters patrolled their skies unopposed. The very idea of German air superiority, once central to Nazi propaganda, was gone. Every raid, every airfield attack, every passing Mustang overhead was a reminder of that loss. It was a humiliation as much as a defeat, and it reached deep into the German psyche. The invincible Reich had lost control of its own sky. For the Allies, this dominance created opportunities that went far beyond aerial combat. The success of the bombing campaigns accelerated the collapse of German industry. Factories were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Oil production plummeted, rail transport disintegrated, and communication lines failed. The German army began to wither, not from a lack of courage, but from starvation. Starvation of supplies, of fuel, of reinforcements. And behind that starvation stood the P-51 Mustang, its wings cutting across the heart of the Reich, severing the lifelines one by one. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Mustang story is that it almost never happened. The aircraft that changed the course of the war was born out of improvisation, not planning. It was a project designed in a rush to satisfy a foreign request. It was powered by an engine borrowed from another nation. It was fielded at a time when American industry was still learning how to build modern fighters at scale. In another universe, it might have remained an obscure experiment. But in this one, it became the weapon that turned laughter into terror and arrogance into defeat. When the war ended and the Luftwaffe lay in ruins, the Mustang's legacy was secure. It wasn't just another plane. It was the answer to a question that had haunted the Allies for years. How do you defeat an enemy who controls the sky? The answer turned out to be simple, but revolutionary. Build a fighter that can follow him home. And once you can follow him home, you own the sky, his airfields, and eventually, his will to fight. For decades afterward, military strategists would study the P-51's role in the war, analyzing how something so simple could be so transformative. They would point to its design, its range, its engine, and its pilots. But beyond all the technical explanations, the Mustang's true power lay in its message. It taught the world that wars are not won by superiority alone. They are won by persistence, by the refusal to turn back, by the will to go farther than the enemy believes you can. That was the Mustang's greatest weapon, and it is why, even now, its legend endures. As the war drew to a close, the story of the P-51 Mustang became intertwined with the story of the men who flew it. They were young, many barely out of their teens, and yet they carried the fate of nations on their shoulders. Some came from farms, others from cities. Some had dreamed of flying since childhood, while others had enlisted out of duty. What they shared was courage, and a machine that made that courage count. The Mustang didn't make them heroes, but it gave them the means to survive long enough to become legends. Each mission began the same way. The rumble of engines warming up before dawn, the smell of oil and metal, the nervous silence before takeoff. Pilots strapped into their seats, checked their instruments, and waited for the signal. When the order came, the roar of dozens of Merlin engines filled the air, shaking the ground. They taxied out one by one, lifted into the rising sun, and vanished into the morning haze. From the ground, it was a sight of breathtaking beauty, a dance of precision and power. But for those in the cockpit, it was something else entirely. It was stepping into the unknown, where life and death were separated by inches and seconds. The missions could last 8 hours or more, long stretches of emptiness broken by sudden chaos. The monotony of formation flying would give way to a split-second flash of danger, a speck on the horizon, a burst of tracer fire, a twist of the stick, and then everything blurred into motion. Combat at 30,000 feet was like a chess game played at lightning speed, every move and counter-move measured in heartbeats. A single mistake could mean death, but hesitation could mean the same. It was in these moments that the Mustang's true brilliance shone. It responded instantly, faithfully, almost instinctively. It didn't just extend a pilot's reach, it extended his reflexes, his senses, his will to live. Many pilots spoke later about how the Mustang seemed to understand them. They could feel its weight, its tension, its energy. It wasn't a brute force machine like the Thunderbolt, nor a fragile dancer like the Spitfire. It was balance incarnate, strong but graceful, fast but steady. It allowed its pilot to decide the fight. Against the German Bf-109 or FW-190, the Mustang had the edge in endurance and high-altitude performance. Against almost anything else, it simply dominated. It turned combat from survival into art, and for those who mastered it, it gave an almost godlike sense of control. But control was never absolute. The air war remained brutally dangerous until the very end. Flak fire could tear through a formation without warning. Collisions in heavy cloud cover were common. Pilots were lost to mechanical failure, bad weather, or simple exhaustion. Even with the Mustang's range, running out of fuel over enemy territory was a constant fear. And for every pilot who made it home, another didn't. The sky was vast, but it was littered with ghosts. The Mustangs might have ruled it, but they did not escape its cost. The stories that came back from the front spoke to that duality, triumph and tragedy in equal measure. There were tales of pilots bringing crippled Mustangs home with half their wings shot away, landing on fumes, their engines coughing smoke. There were stories of dogfights so intense that pilots emerged from the cockpit trembling, unable to unclench their hands from the stick. And there were quieter stories, too, of young men staring out over the blackened landscape below, realizing that every explosion they saw meant another piece of the world ending. The Mustang gave them victory, but it also forced them to witness destruction on a scale no one had ever imagined. The German pilots experienced that destruction from the other side. Many described the skies of 1944 and 1945 as a kind of living nightmare. The constant presence of Allied fighters, the relentless bombing, the sense of helplessness, it was overwhelming. One Luftwaffe veteran recalled that by the war's final months, simply surviving a mission was considered an accomplishment. "We didn't talk about winning anymore," he said. "We talked about getting back." The Mustang had made every sortie an act of defiance against reality itself. Even the bravest couldn't fight that kind of inevitability forever. And yet, for all its terror, the P-51 also represented a kind of beauty. Even German pilots admitted it. They would later describe how they sometimes found themselves admiring the Mustang's elegance in mid-combat, the shimmer of its silver skin in the sunlight, the perfect line of its wings. Some even said that if they were destined to be shot down, they would rather it be by a Mustang than anything else. There was a strange respect in that sentiment, a recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary, even in defeat. The Allied pilots felt that same reverence from the other side. They knew they were flying something special, something beyond ordinary. When the war ended, many struggled to adjust to life without it. "I'd look up at the sky," one pilot said, "and I'd miss the sound. That sound meant I was alive." For years afterward, veterans would gather at reunions, talking about their old squadrons, their friends, and the plane that had carried them through it all. Some still dreamed of it. Dreams of endless skies, of the horizon rolling away beneath them, of the comforting hum of the Merlin that never seemed to stop. The bond between man and Mustang became a kind of mythology in itself. It symbolized not just victory, but transformation. The moment when the war turned from defense to dominance, when fear gave way to confidence. It was the sound of the tide turning, the engine note of hope. To the soldiers on the ground and the civilians in occupied Europe, that sound meant something else entirely: freedom. When they heard Mustangs overhead, they knew the enemy's grip was slipping. The same machine that terrified German pilots inspired courage in those waiting for liberation below. Even as the war's focus shifted to the final battles on the ground, the Mustang remained an ever-present force. It flew reconnaissance over enemy territory, strafed retreating convoys, and escorted bombers on their last missions. Its pilots saw the world below crumble. Cities in ruins, rivers clogged with wreckage, columns of prisoners marching along frozen roads. They saw what victory looked like up close, and it wasn't glorious. It was broken and gray and silent. But it was victory nonetheless, and the Mustang had helped make it possible. By the time Germany finally surrendered, the P-51 had flown hundreds of thousands of missions. It had destroyed thousands of enemy planes, decimated supply lines, and reshaped the very concept of aerial warfare. But its greatest achievement was something less tangible. It had changed the way the world thought about distance, about endurance, about what was possible in the sky. It had proven that technology could be more than a weapon. It could be a force of will, an extension of human determination. When the pilots returned home, they brought that lesson with them. Many went on to shape the future of aviation, aerospace. Some became test pilots for the new generation of jets. Others joined NASA, contributing to the early space programs. The discipline, courage, and precision they had learned in the Mustang carried them into the next frontier. In a way, the P-51's legacy didn't end with the war. It evolved, soaring higher than its creators could have imagined. In museums today, Mustangs sit on display behind ropes and placards, silent and still. But to those who know their history, they are more than relics. They are reminders of a time when the outcome of the world's greatest conflict depended on men and machines in perfect harmony. They are proof that courage can take shape in metal and motion. And when one of those engines starts up at an air show, the sound still echoes across time. The same growl that once made the Luftwaffe tremble and made the oppressed look up with hope. That's the paradox of the Mustang. It was both a destroyer and a savior, both a symbol of death and of freedom. It was born from necessity, refined by innovation, and immortalized by victory. It was the plane that taught the world that range was power, that endurance was strength, and that sometimes the simplest advantage, a few hundred extra miles of fuel, can change the course of history. The war may have ended in 1945, but the legend of the P-51 Mustang was only just beginning. As Europe lay in ruins and the world began to rebuild, stories of the Mustang spread far beyond the airfields and battlefronts where it had earned its fame. It became a symbol of the new kind of warfare that had defined the 20th century: fast, precise, and global. Pilots who had flown it couldn't stop talking about it, and those who hadn't wished they could. Even among the Allies, the Mustang was something of a marvel, a British idea, an American masterpiece, and an international symbol of what could be achieved when necessity met innovation. The aircraft's post-war life was proof of its versatility. Instead of being retired, many Mustangs continued to serve in air forces around the world. They flew for countries across Europe, Asia, and South America. In Israel's war for independence, Mustangs once again fought against odds, carrying the same spirit of defiance they had shown in Europe. In Korea, they returned to combat, flying low and fast over rugged terrain, attacking ground targets with devastating accuracy. Even in the jet age, the Mustang proved it still had a place. It couldn't match the speed of a jet, but it could fly longer, carry more, and hit harder than most early jets could manage. It was the last of the great piston fighters and the first to make the leap into a new era. But the Mustang's real victory wasn't just technological, it was philosophical. It changed how nations thought about war from the sky. Before it, air combat had been local, limited to narrow ranges and short bursts of fighting. After it, warfare became global, strategic, and sustained. The Mustang showed that air power could project across entire continents. It proved that a nation that controlled the air could shape every battle on the ground. This lesson would shape the entire Cold War, where range and endurance became the holy grail of military aviation. The same logic that created the Mustang eventually led to jet bombers, long-range fighters, and even intercontinental missiles. Its DNA ran through them all. In America, the Mustang became more than just a warplane. It became a national treasure. Air shows in the 1950s and 60s often featured them as the centerpiece attraction. Veterans would stand along the flight line, pointing up as the familiar silver shape streaked overhead. Crowds cheered not just for the spectacle, but for what it represented: courage, victory, and the unbreakable will of a generation. Children who watched those shows grew up to become pilots themselves, inspired by the very sound that had once echoed across the battlefields of Europe. The Mustang became timeless, crossing from history into heritage. Yet even as the plane became a symbol of pride, it also carried the memory of loss. Every surviving Mustang was a reminder of those who never returned. Some airfields still had empty spots where pilots were last seen taking off and never coming back. Their names were engraved on memorials, their stories kept alive by those who had flown beside them. To the veterans, the Mustang wasn't just an aircraft. It was a grave marker in the sky. Every time its engine started, it carried the voices of the fallen. Every flight was a tribute to their sacrifice. Decades later, historians began to re-examine the war through a more critical lens, and the Mustang's story took on new layers of meaning. They saw it not only as a marvel of engineering, but as a turning point in human warfare. It had made victory possible, but it had also made destruction more efficient. The bombers it escorted leveled entire cities. Its dominance ensured that the air war could continue without resistance. Some began to call the Mustang a paradox, symbol of freedom that also represented the mechanization of death. And yet, even within that contradiction, it retained its aura of greatness. Because whatever one thought of the war itself, the Mustang remained pure in purpose, a weapon that did exactly what it was built to do and did it with unmatched precision. For the German pilots who survived the war, time softened the bitterness, leaving behind respect. Many were invited to post-war air shows, where they met their former enemies as old men instead of adversaries. Standing side by side with American pilots, they would look up together as a Mustang roared overhead. Some smiled. Others grew quiet. They knew better than anyone what that sound meant. It was the sound of defeat, but also of history, of progress, of everything that had changed since those terrible years. "She was beautiful," one former Luftwaffe pilot said simply. "Too beautiful to hate." The Mustang's legacy also endured in the countless personal stories that emerged long after the war. Letters, diaries, and interviews revealed what it had meant to those who lived under its wings. French resistance fighters recalled seeing Mustangs flying low over the countryside before D-Day, signaling that liberation was near. Dutch villagers remembered pilots dropping candy for children as they passed overhead. To the people of occupied Europe, the sight of a Mustang meant hope. It meant that the tide had turned, that the darkness that had blanketed their world was finally beginning to lift. In a sense, the Mustang was more than just an instrument of war. It was a messenger. It carried the promise that tyranny could be beaten, that courage could fly farther than fear. It was proof that no empire, no matter how powerful, could hold the sky forever. The very idea that Allied fighters could follow the Luftwaffe all the way home, circling their airfields like vultures, sent a message that echoed through the entire German command structure. Nowhere is safe. That psychological blow was as important as any bomb dropped on a factory. It was the moment the hunters realized they had become the hunted. In the decades after the war, the Mustang appeared in films, documentaries, and books, its legend retold and reshaped with each generation. It became the embodiment of a certain kind of heroism, the kind that was fast, daring, and relentless. Movies portrayed its pilots as knights of the air, their Mustangs as shining steeds. The comparison was apt. Like the knights of old, they had flown into battle for a cause larger than themselves, risking everything in the pursuit of victory. And like those ancient warriors, their deeds would be remembered long after their weapons had been set aside. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Mustang story is how human it remains. For all the numbers and statistics, the thousands of missions, the hundreds of aces, the tonnage of bombs, it always comes back to the individual. The young man, gripping the control stick as flak bursts around him. The mechanic who stays up all night patching bullet holes so the plane can fly again at dawn. The bomber crew who look up in relief when they see that sleek silver shape appear beside them. The German pilot who knows, the moment he spots it, that his luck has run out. The Mustang connected all of them on both sides of the war in one shared truth. The sky decides everything. And the sky, once claimed by the Luftwaffe, now belonged to the Mustang. In the years that followed, that ownership became symbolic. The plane that had once hunted German fighters became a universal image of liberation. It appeared in museums and murals, on postage stamps and commemorative coins. When veterans marched in parades, the Mustang often flew overhead, dipping its wings in salute. It was as if the plane itself had become a living representative of that generation's courage. Time might have faded the memories, but the sound of that engine, the smooth, rolling growl of the Merlin, kept them alive. Even now, more than 80 years later, when a P-51 flies, it draws people to it. Pilots stop to watch. Children cover their ears at the noise, then stare in awe as it streaks across the sky. The old veterans, if they're there, always look up. And for a few moments, they're young again. They can smell the oil, feel the vibration in their bones, and remember what it was like to live in the moment between danger and victory. The Mustang doesn't just fly through the air, it flies through time. As the decades rolled on, the P-51 Mustang transcended its wartime origins to become a permanent fixture in the mythology of aviation. It wasn't just remembered as a weapon, it was remembered as a moment in history when technology and humanity collided to create something extraordinary. Every polished aluminum panel, every rivet, every roar of the Merlin engine told the story of a world that had changed forever. To those who studied it, the Mustang represented the golden age of flight, the time before the skies became dominated by computers and radar, when victory still depended on the nerve and instinct of a single human being. The post-war generation of pilots revered it almost as a rite of passage. Flying a Mustang became a badge of honor, a connection to the men who had fought and died in it. Aviation clubs formed around restoring and maintaining surviving aircraft. Mechanics scoured scrapyards for original parts, sometimes traveling across continents to find an authentic canopy or wing spar. Restoring a Mustang wasn't just an act of preservation, it was an act of devotion. Every restored plane was a resurrection, bringing back a piece of living history that refused to fade into photographs and textbooks. Even in an age of supersonic jets and digital cockpits, pilots who had flown both still spoke of the Mustang with awe. They said that no jet, no matter how advanced, could ever match the feeling of flying one. Jets were efficient, yes, cold, clinical, predictable. The Mustang, by contrast, was alive. It demanded skill, it punished mistakes, and it rewarded bravery. It spoke through the stick and the pedals. It taught its pilots humility and confidence in equal measure. "You didn't just fly it," one modern pilot said. "You earned it." That was the essence of the P-51, a machine that never gave anything for free. In historical circles, the Mustang became a symbol of what many called the moment the Allies mastered the air. Historians and military theorists dissected its role in countless books and documentaries. They analyzed its design, its strategy, its psychological impact. Some pointed out that it wasn't just the plane itself, but the timing of its arrival that made it so decisive. The Mustang appeared when the Luftwaffe was stretched thin, when German fuel supplies were dwindling, and when Allied industry was at its peak. It was the right weapon at the right time, a culmination of everything the Allies had learned in 5 brutal years of war. But even with all that analysis, the emotional weight of the Mustang story could never be captured in data. The facts were impressive. Over 15,000 HALs built, thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed, countless missions completed. Yet none of those numbers conveyed the feeling of a Mustang breaking through cloud cover at sunrise, its polished wings flashing gold in the light. None of them captured the sound of its 6 machine guns thundering in unison, or the silence that followed when the sky cleared and the fight was over. The Mustang wasn't just a collection of statistics, it was an experience, one that burned itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. For the Germans, that experience was one of dread and awe. Pilots who faced the P-51 in combat spoke decades later with a mixture of respect and resignation. "It was the end of our world," said one former Luftwaffe ace. "We knew, when we saw them, that the war was lost." There was something almost poetic about the way the Mustang symbolized the turning of the tide. The aircraft the Germans had once mocked had come back to dominate the skies they once ruled. The laughter that had greeted its first arrival had been replaced by silence, broken only by the sound of its engines echoing across a dying Reich. And yet, for all its destruction, the Mustang was also remembered as a liberator. In the villages of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, people who had lived under occupation still spoke of the day the Mustangs appeared overhead. It wasn't the bombers they remembered, nor the artillery or tanks, but the fighters. The sleek silver planes with their long noses and white stripes became the first sign that freedom was returning. To those on the ground, they looked like angels of deliverance, streaking across the sky faster than anything they had ever seen. The same aircraft that terrorized the Luftwaffe gave hope to millions. That duality, the Mustang as both weapon and symbol, is what makes its legacy so enduring. It reminds us that technology itself is neutral. It becomes good or evil only in the hands that wield it. The P-51 was designed to kill, but it also saved lives by ending a war, by protecting bombers, by ensuring that tyranny could no longer reach the skies. In that way, it became a paradox made of metal and motion, a destroyer of enemies and a guardian of peace. Even today, aviation experts still marvel at its engineering. The laminar flow wing, once considered a risky experiment, proved revolutionary. It reduced drag and gave the aircraft a range that changed the war. The decision to pair the American airframe with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was another stroke of genius, one born of necessity but destined to make history. Together they produced a machine that was elegant, efficient, and deadly. It's often said that perfection is impossible in war, but the Mustang came close. The Allied pilots who flew it became household names, their stories inspiring generations to come. George Preddy, Bud Anderson, Chuck Yeager, men who embodied both skill and humility. They were not reckless daredevils, but craftsmen of survival. They learned to read the sky, to anticipate their enemies, to trust their machines. The Mustang allowed them to do more than fight. It allowed them to excel. Some went on to become test pilots, exploring the limits of flight itself. Others became instructors, teaching the next generation of aviators the lessons they had learned in combat: discipline, patience, and respect for the machine. Meanwhile, in post-war Germany, the ruins of the Luftwaffe became a cautionary tale. The arrogance that had once driven its dominance was replaced by a deep introspection. When German engineers and pilots later joined new aviation programs, many even working alongside their former enemies, they carried with them the hard-earned respect for what the Allies had achieved. The Mustang had taught them a lesson they would never forget. Superiority is fleeting, but adaptability is eternal. The Germans had been first to master the air, but they had failed to evolve when the world changed around them. The Mustang was the embodiment of that evolution. At airfields across the United States, Mustangs continued to fly in the years after the war, their engines echoing through peacetime skies. They were used in races, breaking speed records that few thought possible for a piston-engine plane. Their design was so refined that even stripped of weapons, they still seemed like predators. Sleek, poised, and full of potential energy, they became icons not only of war but of flight itself. Pilots described them as the perfect intersection between beauty and purpose. They looked fast even when standing still. By the time the 1960s arrived, only a few hundred Mustangs were still airworthy. But their legend was larger than ever. They appeared in movies, on posters, and in history books. They were no longer just machines. They were symbols of a generation's triumph over tyranny. When a Mustang flew overhead at an air show, veterans would take off their caps and stand silently. The sound of its engine was like a time machine, carrying them back to the skies over Europe, to a time when the world was on fire, and the outcome was still uncertain. For a few moments, they could relive what it felt like to be young and fearless, to hold the fate of nations in their hands. And even those who had never fought felt it. The younger generations who grew up hearing those stories saw the Mustang as something pure, a reminder that at least once in history, courage and innovation had combined to defeat evil. It became a mythic creature of sorts, the kind of machine that seemed too perfect to belong to the real world. But it was real. It had flown through storms of steel and fire, and it had come out the other side victorious. That victory wasn't just military. It was moral. The Mustang represented the idea that freedom could fight back, that the forces of oppression could be met not just with defiance, but with mastery. The laughter that had once greeted it in the Luftwaffe's ready rooms was gone forever. In its place came silence, respect, and the understanding that the Mustang had changed everything. The P-51 Mustang story did not end in the ashes of World War II. It carried forward, rippling through history like a sonic echo. In every sense, it was the blueprint for the modern fighter: range, versatility, endurance, and dominance. What it proved was not merely that better technology could win wars, but that the right technology, wielded with courage and purpose, could change the destiny of nations. It had begun as an afterthought, a rushed design for an ally's request, and yet it became one of the most decisive creations in military history. In post-war debriefings, Allied commanders often reflected that without the Mustang, the bombing campaign against Germany might have failed. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators could have continued their lonely missions, but their losses would have remained catastrophic. The Mustang was the missing puzzle piece that made the strategy work. Its range made every corner of Germany reachable, and its presence made every bomber's mission survivable. This wasn't just about numbers, it was about momentum. When the Luftwaffe lost control of its own skies, the collapse of the Reich became inevitable. Strategically, the P-51 represented the transition from tactical air power to strategic air dominance. Before it, air warfare was mostly reactive, fighters intercepting enemy bombers or defending key areas. After the Mustang, the entire concept changed. The Allies could now impose their will anywhere, at any time, from the air. It was total control, achieved through endurance and precision. This philosophy would define every air campaign that followed, from Korea to Vietnam to the Gulf War. Every jet fighter, from the F-86 Sabre to the F-22 Raptor, owed something to the lessons the Mustang had written in blood and smoke. But what made the Mustang so timeless wasn't just its effectiveness, it was its soul. There was something about its shape, its sound, its presence that transcended mere machinery. The long, graceful nose, the low canopy, the way it seemed to glide even at high speed. It was art in motion. Engineers could describe its specifications, but pilots felt its poetry. It was one of those rare machines that existed perfectly at the intersection of beauty and purpose. Its form followed its function so elegantly that it seemed designed by nature itself. For those who fought against it, that beauty was a cruel irony. German pilots recalled seeing Mustangs in their gun sights and feeling a strange admiration even as they prepared to die. "They looked like eagles," one veteran wrote. "Beautiful, deadly eagles." Another described the sound of the Merlin engine as the herald of doom. You didn't see it first. You heard it, that deep growl. Then the sky would split, and it was there. Those words captured the essence of the Mustang's power, not just its physical dominance, but its psychological presence. It didn't need to shoot to make its point. Its mere existence said everything. And yet, for all the fear it inspired, the Mustang also brought something profoundly human to the war. Its pilots were not faceless operators of a machine. They were young men who carried photos of loved ones in their flight jackets, who sang to themselves through oxygen masks, who risked their lives for people they would never meet. They were the bridge between the human and the mechanical, the living and the engineered. The Mustang gave them wings, but it also reminded them of their fragility. Every mission was a test of endurance, not just of metal, but of spirit. One American ace, Captain Clarence "Bud" Anderson, later reflected that the P-51 was more than just a tool. It was a companion. "She never let me down," he said. "She took care of me, and I took care of her." That sentiment echoed across generations of pilots. The Mustang wasn't just a plane you flew, it was a plane you trusted, even loved. It gave its pilots something rare in war: confidence without arrogance, control without illusion. When they took off, they knew they were flying the best machine in the sky, and that belief gave them the edge they needed to survive. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could only watch as its pilots were hunted even over their own bases. What had begun as tactical superiority had turned into a slow, methodical erasure. German commanders tried everything: new aircraft, new tactics, even jet-powered interceptors. But it was too late. The Mustang's long reach ensured that no matter where they moved, the Allies would be waiting. The once mighty air force that had conquered the skies of Europe had been reduced to desperation, its pilots scattering before an enemy they could no longer match. The collapse was not just physical, but symbolic. When German pilots realized that the Allies could follow them home, literally to their airfields, it broke something deeper than strategy. It shattered the illusion of sanctuary. The Luftwaffe had lived on the belief that even in retreat, they had control of the air over Germany. The Mustang ended that fantasy. "We used to think we could run," one pilot said. "Then the Mustangs came and we knew there was nowhere left to go." The psychological toll of that revelation was immense. Every flight became an act of survival rather than combat. For the Allies, this shift marked a new era of confidence. The Mustang's success allowed bomber crews to fly deeper, more often, and with fewer losses. Each successful mission strengthened morale not just in the air, but on the ground and at home. Newspapers hailed the P-51 as a miracle weapon. Families of airmen read about its range and power with relief, believing, rightly, that their sons now had a fighting chance to come home. In a war defined by uncertainty, the Mustang brought assurance. Its effectiveness also reshaped the Allied command structure. Generals who once planned cautious bombing raids could now think in terms of total air supremacy. The Mustang wasn't just extending missions, it was rewriting them. Targets that had once been unreachable became routine. Missions that would have been suicidal became standard operations. In that sense, the P-51 didn't just protect bombers, it liberated them. It allowed the Allies to use the full potential of their air fleets without fear of catastrophic losses. That freedom changed everything. Industrial centers, oil fields, and transportation hubs across Germany were destroyed systematically. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend its own resources, and the army on the ground began to suffocate without fuel or supplies. In just months, the Mustang had turned the air war from a defensive stalemate into an offensive steamroller. It was the embodiment of the old military truth: the best defense is a good offense. When peace finally came, the Mustangs returned home in triumph, their wings scarred and their engines worn, but their legacy untarnished. Some were scrapped, others sold, but many found new lives in peacetime roles: training, reconnaissance, and air racing. Those that survived became cherished relics, passed down like heirlooms. Pilots who had flown them often said it felt strange to see them grounded, silent, as if lions had been caged. The sky seemed emptier without them. Yet in a sense, the Mustang never truly landed. Its spirit endured, in the textbooks, in the museums, in the stories told at reunions and air shows. It remained a reminder of what could happen when ingenuity met necessity. It was proof that sometimes the weapon that changes history isn't the biggest or the most advanced, but the one that arrives at precisely the right time, in precisely the right hands. And the P-51 Mustang had done just that. By the time the guns of Europe fell silent, the P-51 Mustang had become more than an aircraft. It was a legend forged in the skies. The laughter that had greeted its arrival was gone forever, replaced by a kind of reverent silence. To those who had fought beneath its wings, the Mustang represented the turning of fate itself. It was the moment the hunted became the hunter, when the balance of power in the air and in the war shifted for good. The Germans had begun the conflict with absolute faith in their Luftwaffe. They believed no one could challenge their mastery of the sky. That faith carried them through the early years, through the lightning victories of Blitzkrieg and the thunder of the Battle of Britain. But by 1944, that confidence had rotted into fear. The Mustang's range, speed, and persistence meant that even retreat was no refuge. It was a new kind of warfare, one that didn't just destroy an enemy's forces, but their will to fight. For the Luftwaffe, the arrival of the P-51 was the sound of inevitability. For Allied pilots, it was liberation. The men who once watched helplessly as bombers burned now flew in formation with a fighter that could match, even surpass, anything the enemy sent against them. They could defend, they could attack, and most importantly, they could go home. That simple change, making survival a realistic expectation, transformed the psychology of air combat. Morale soared. Missions became bolder. And for the first time, the Allies truly believed that air superiority was not just possible, but permanent. On the ground, that change echoed in ways no one could have predicted. The industrial heart of Germany, the factories, rail lines, and oil fields that powered its war machine, crumbled under the unrelenting pressure of Allied bombing. The Mustang made those missions possible, turning strategic plans into unstoppable realities. Even the Wehrmacht, once confident in its air cover, began to feel the loss. The P-51 wasn't just winning dogfights, it was starving the enemy into submission. The sky had become a weapon of attrition, and the Mustang was its sharpest blade. Yet for all its technical brilliance, what truly set the P-51 apart was its human element. It was a plane that rewarded courage and punished hesitation. It asked everything of its pilots, but gave everything in return. Those who mastered it spoke of the strange connection between man and machine, a unity that felt almost alive. In combat, the Mustang became an extension of its pilots' thoughts. It climbed when they needed it to climb, rolled when they willed it to roll, and when death closed in, It responded with the same will to live as the man in the cockpit. That bond was rare, and it made the Mustang more than just an aircraft. It made it a partner in survival. German pilots came to understand that relationship from the other side. They could tell when they were fighting a Mustang veteran, the movements, the confidence, the patience. Those pilots didn't charge recklessly or fall for feints. They stalked, waited, and struck with surgical precision. It was like being hunted by a shadow, one Luftwaffe ace recalled. You never saw them until it was too late. The Mustang turned the air war into a chess match where the Allies always seemed one move ahead. And once that happened, the outcome was certain. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, the Mustang remained ever present above them. It strafed convoys, cut off retreating troops, and shattered the remnants of the Luftwaffe wherever it tried to regroup. It circled over surrendering divisions and liberated cities, its silver fuselage glinting in the spring sunlight. For the people on the ground, its silhouette meant freedom. For the German soldiers below, it meant the end. The plane that had once been dismissed as a toy now stood as the symbol of Allied dominance, the instrument of the Reich's undoing. In the post-war years, the P-51 became the yardstick by which every other fighter was measured. It was not the fastest nor the heaviest armed, but it was perfectly balanced. An aircraft with no wasted design, no unnecessary complexity. It was efficient, lethal, and graceful. Test pilots and engineers studied it for decades, its aerodynamic efficiency influencing the design of countless aircraft that came after. Even in the jet age, when speed doubled and technology leapt forward, the Mustang's legacy remained embedded in every wing, every fuselage, every blueprint. It had defined what a fighter should be. For the men who flew it, however, the Mustang was more than a machine. It was memory made metal. It carried them through the fire and brought them home. Some never stopped dreaming of it. The sound of the engine, the vibration of the stick, the smell of oil and cold air at high altitude. Decades later, when they climbed into restored Mustangs at air shows, their hands would automatically find the controls, their feet the rudder pedals. The muscle memory of survival never faded. "When I fly her," one veteran said softly, "I feel like I'm 20 again. And the war, it's yesterday." For the Germans who had faced it, the passage of time brought perspective. Many who once cursed its name came to admire it. In reunions between former enemies, they spoke of the respect they held for the men who flew it and the aircraft that had defeated them. They knew now that it had not been mere numbers or luck. It had been innovation, adaptation, and determination. "We laughed when we first saw it," one Luftwaffe officer admitted years later. "We thought it was another American mistake, but it was us who made the mistake. We underestimated it, and by the time we realized, it was already too late." That single admission captures the entire essence of the Mustang story. It is the story of underestimation turned into revelation, of mockery turned into fear, of defeat turned into history. It is proof that war is not always won by those who start strongest, but by those who learn fastest. The P-51 was the embodiment of that lesson, a reminder that innovation is born not from pride, but from necessity. Today, when a Mustang takes to the air, its sound is unmistakable, a deep rolling thunder that resonates through time. Crowds look up, cameras ready, but for a moment the noise silences conversation. It is the same sound that once shook the skies over Berlin, that once made the Luftwaffe's bravest men grip their controls in dread. It's not just the sound of an engine, it's the sound of history, of victory, of transformation. The sound of a machine that proved range could conquer power, that courage could outfly arrogance, and that the hunter could become the hunted. And perhaps that's why, even after all these years, the P-51 Mustang still flies. Not just in museums, not just in books or films, but in the collective imagination of all who dream of flight. It soars across time as a testament to human ingenuity and endurance. It reminds us that laughter can turn to fear, that the mighty can fall, and that sometimes the simplest advantage, a few extra miles of fuel, a better engine, a smarter design, can change the course of history. The German pilots had laughed at the P-51 Mustang, but by the end, they weren't laughing anymore. They were looking up, they were listening to the roar, and they were watching the hunters circle home.